Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to wait a minute or two here as people are joining, and then we'll get started. If you're just joining us, we're just waiting about a minute or so to get people connected, and then we'll get started. It looks like that's slowed down. So we can go ahead and get started with the introduction as people continue to jump on. But good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn around the election and what public officials need to know about local ballot measures and candidate elections. I'm Melissa Keene. I'm a senior program manager with the Institute for Local Government, and I'll be your host and your moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Here's a quick overview of our agenda for today. We're just going to do a really quick welcome and introductions, and then we'll spend the bulk of today's webinar on a presentation from Craig Steele around elections and ballot measures. And then we do have about 15 minutes held to do some Q&A towards the end of the webinar, and then we will wrap up and adjourn by 1 o'clock. Quick housekeeping. You've probably noticed as you jump on that you are muted, and you will be muted for the duration of today's webinar, but we definitely welcome questions, written questions via the Q&A box. We will be monitoring that throughout, answering questions as we go, and then as I just mentioned, we will have a time for a more thorough Q&A towards the end of the session. You also probably noticed when you jumped on that we are recording, and we will be posting the recording of the session as well as the slide deck after today's webinar, and that will be distributed to all of you that are on the line as well. So before we jump in, I just want to share some high-level information about ILG in case you aren't super familiar with us. We are a statewide nonprofit that's affiliated with the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. So we work statewide with local agencies to provide practical and easy-to-use resources so that you all can more effectively implement policies on the ground. We do that in a number of ways. We provide a lot of education and training, such as today's webinar, but we also provide technical assistance and capacity building and convening services to agencies statewide in our 4 main issue areas. So you see those on the left of the screen, but we focus on leadership and governance, which is where this conversation fits in. So a lot of the state mandated trainings, as well as information to help you all navigate the legal and regulatory landscape that you have to work within. As well as how to work as a governance team with your elected officials and your staff. In addition to leadership and governance, we also have programs that focus on civics education and workforce, so getting folks in and recruitment and retention challenges, the pipeline into public service. We have a program focused on public engagement. So how do you do that more proactively and strategically and authentically? A lot of training and resources there. And then lastly, sustainable and resilient communities. A lot of work around climate action and housing and land use and things of that nature. So a lot of free resources, a lot of free training on our website. So if you haven't already, please check that out and definitely reach out if you have any questions. But we have a short amount of time and a lot of content to cover, so I don't want to spend any more time before we delay and get into the presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Craig Steele, who is a shareholder with Richards, Watson, and Gershon, and he is going to give a little bit more thorough of an introduction of himself, and then we're going to jump right in. So Craig, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and appreciate you all for stopping in for a lunch and learn. I see some familiar names on the registration for the seminar, and good to see all of you who have been with us before. This may not be a whole lot different than presentations on this subject you've seen me give before, but it's always good to kind of have a refresher, especially as we dive into election season. And you'd have to be living under a rock or on a desert island somewhere to not know that we're heading into election season in this country and in this state. And maybe some of us would rather be living on a desert island for the next several months, but But we're not. And so tomorrow, as it happens, is the end of the candidate nomination period. It's also the deadline for putting measures on the ballot for the November election. We've seen an extraordinary number of local government measures just in our office put on the ballot this year. I know that there are agencies all over the state that have revenue measures, have land use measures, a lot of different content related to local government on the November election. There's also some statewide measures and maybe county measures that have impact on local government. There's a climate action bond. There's some other things that local governments are going to be really interested in the outcome of. So it's timely to just kind of go over the concepts about cities participating in elections. I'm going to focus mostly on ballot measures because that's kind of where most of the action is and most of the questions come up. But just be aware that even as I do talk about some candidate related stuff, these concepts about advocacy and impartiality that I'm going to keep going back to really do apply to both kinds of elections, whether we're talking about candidates or ballot measures. The key to remember is that in the elections context, the elections official, normally the city clerk or the district clerk in the case of special districts, is the elections official and has to remain impartial. The city itself, even though our bosses may be on the ballot or might have put a measure on the ballot, the city itself has to remain impartial as well, and cannot really put the thumb on the scale of the election. Um, Cities and public agencies have authority to lobby the legislature to go up to Sacramento and say, "Hey, change this law," or "Please adopt this new law." Cities have and special districts and counties have the ability, the constitutional authority to put measures on the ballot to ask the voters what they think about an issue. Public agencies do not have the authority to lobby the voters. You do not have the authority to spend public resources to help the voters make up their mind for or against a candidate or an issue. Next slide, please. We're really talking here about the use of public resources, talking about the use of public money to inform voters or influence the election. And the former state treasurer, Jesse Unruh, once said, "Money is the mother's milk of politics." And in what I'm talking about today, it's really all about the money. Money spent to either inform the voters in an impartial way versus money that would be improperly spent to influence the voters, whether it's relating to the election of a candidate or a ballot measure. Candidate elections are more straightforward. And I think we all can understand that public resources cannot be used to try to influence the voters to vote for or against a candidate. That means that incumbents can't use the resources of their office to promote their own candidacy. Excuse me. It means that city staff can't use public resources to support or oppose a political candidate. For ballot measures, there's a lot more nuance to it, and there's a lot more context based on the timing. And I divide the two phases into preparation phase and a campaign phase. The preparation phase is that time when city staff, city elected officials are trying to decide whether to advance a ballot measure and order it onto the ballot, as opposed to the time at which there's a clearly identified ballot measure that we have said is going forward at the November election. And we know that what now we're doing is we're in a phase where people are trying to convince the voters one way or the other. In that phase, that campaign phase, public resources cannot be used in that endeavor to try to persuade the voters one way or another. So think about that line between preparation and the actual consideration of the measure. Once there's a clearly identified ballot measure, the rules really change. And after tomorrow, when in most of your cases, if you've got a measure on the ballot already, There already is a clearly identified measure, but tomorrow is the deadline for there being clearly identified ballot measures. And that's the bright line at which all of the rules regarding the use of public resources really change. And we move into a phase of considering whether our communications are to be considered information or advocacy. Information in an impartial way is permitted, advocacy is not. Unfortunately, the line between the two is not as clear as in the last bullet point. And so what I'm here to do is try to talk to you about a few factors that are used to determine whether or not communication is information or advocacy. Next slide, please. Everything is derived from a California Supreme Court case in the 70s called Stanson versus Mott. And Stanson versus Mott is a case where the California Supreme Court held that without statutory authorization, public agencies may not expend public funds to influence the voters for or against a measure. And I just told you in the prior slide, there is no statutory authorization to use public funds to influence the voters. So every expenditure of funds, the intent for which is to influence the voters, is per se illegal because there isn't any statutory authorization to do it. And the quote from the Supreme Court case that kind of lays down the philosophy is the selective use of public funds in election campaigns, of course, raises the specter of an improper distortion of the electoral process. It's this concept of government putting its thumb on the scales in an election, and that's not permitted. Next slide, please. Stanton versus Mott, however, recognizes the, quote, informational role that public agencies must play. Public agencies have to give their constituents information about the nature of a ballot measure, especially if it's a complicated issue. And so there's an impartial public information role that public agencies play. The case also noted the possibility of personal liability for improper political expenditures in the exercise of due care. And I'm going to talk about that personal liability in a moment. And it raised what it called this dichotomy between campaign activity and informational activity. And now for 40 plus years, we've been trying to figure out, and other courts have ruled and given us additional guidance as to what's campaign activity versus what's informational activity. As things have progressed over the last few years, the Fair Political Practices Commission has taken a much more active role in looking at public agency information campaigns in connection with ballot measures. They've adopted regulations that provide much greater definition and certainly argue for caution in the use of public resources. They definitely now view more they skew their view more toward public resources being used for advocacy in ways that we used to think were more informational. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the envelope, I think my basic point is to getting your message out is large enough. And the risk is so great that you shouldn't push that envelope. So I'm going to give a couple of ideas at the end of the presentation as to how impartial information can be presented legally, and urge you not to push the envelope, even though there's a great urge to do so because so many of these measures are important to your agency, and there's probably not enough people out in the community talking about it without public agency support. Next slide, please. Government Code Section 8314 is one of two statutes that makes it illegal to spend public funds or public resources to support or oppose a candidate or a ballot measure. There's a small exception in 8314 that says fair and impartial presentation of relevant facts to aid the electorate in reaching an informed judgment regarding the bond issue or ballot measure in communications otherwise permitted by law. So fair and impartial presentation of relevant facts. That's what we're aiming for in terms of impartial communications related to a ballot measure. If it starts to push one side of the line or the other, it runs the danger of being in violation of Government Code Section 8314. The penalty for violating this law is possible individual liability for a civil penalty of $1,000 and going up to 3 times the value of the resources illegally expended. So if a public official authorizes the use of public resources that are then used to support or oppose a candidate or a ballot measure, there's a possibility that this civil penalty can be imposed personally on that public official um, for either intentional or negligent violations. Next slide. Government Code Section 54964 is the other statute. Don't know why there's two. I think basically the legislature took a look at this problem a couple of different times and just decided to sort of re-emphasize the issue. Excuse me, but a state or local officer, employer, or consultant may not expend or authorize the expenditure of public funds to support or oppose a ballot measure or a candidate, and it requires a clearly defined measure or candidate. It requires express advocacy. So some of the hidden advocacy I'm going to talk about in a minute may not necessarily violate this statute. And it's a little more explicit because violation of Government Code Section 54964 could result in a misdemeanor prosecution against a public official who violates it. So the standards are a little more specific than they are under 8314 that I discussed a minute ago. Next slide, please. The worst possible violation would be a violation of Penal Code Section 424. This is rarely prosecuted, but I want you to know that it's a possibility. And that's the statute that prevents misappropriation or makes illegal misappropriation of public funds. And that can include the use of funds for personal or political purposes. And Penal Code Section 424, if you violate it, can be a misdemeanor or a felony. It's more frequently prosecuted in cases where public officials use public funds or embezzle public funds for their own personal purposes, not so much in the political context, but it is possible and something you should be aware of as a really serious consequence for misuse of public funds. Next slide. There's a really fine line between what we would call express advocacy, which is a more obvious violation of the law, and the presentation of impartial information, which is not a violation of the law. And then what I'm going to talk about on the next slide, which is more, or 2 slides down, more what I would call hidden advocacy, things that the Fair Political Practices Commission is really interpreting to be advocacy, even though they may not fit the express definition of express advocacy. Because express advocacy is vote yes or vote no. Vote for this person, vote against that person. It's result oriented. It's one-sided. It's emotional and targeted only to either voters in general or certain groups of voters. If that's the communication that a public agency or a public official makes, that's express advocacy, and it can't be done with public resources. I think most people understand that, and most public agencies don't ever go down the road of saying, please vote for our sales tax measure, or y'all should get out and support the mayor using public resources. We all kind of understand that's prohibited. The question is, where's the line between that and what the FPPC now is considering to be what I call hidden advocacy, and this concept of impartial information? Well, impartial information is factual, and it can be attributed to somebody or something in terms of a source. Frequently, impartial information tells both sides of the story. If this measure passes, we will have more revenue to do this. If this measure does not pass, we will have to find revenue from somewhere else to keep providing this level of service. It doesn't always require the presentation of both sides, but it's a pretty good indication that you're trying to be impartial if you present both sides of an argument. It's disseminated widely and not just to voters. So, for example, it's disseminated by a city in a way that's consistent with the way the city disseminates information that's not related to an election. So if you have a city newsletter that goes out quarterly, that goes out to everybody in the city, not just to registered voters, and you send information related to an election to that same list, it's a lot more of an indication that that's impartial communication intended to inform the public about an issue that's important in the city, as opposed to information that's targeted to the voters, which is really looks like it's trying to influence the voters. Impartial information is also consistent with the normal style, tenor, and timing of city communications. If you start creating new graphics, or you only send a mailer to your residents when there's a city measure on the ballot, and otherwise they never get anything from you, if you only use social media to try to get people to pay attention to a ballot measure, and you never use it at any other time to try to get them to come to the concert in the park or sign up for the summer swimming lessons, it looks a lot more like election related influencing as opposed to just normal cadence of public communications on issues that are important to the public. So be aware of being consistent with normal style, tenor, and timing of city communications. Next slide, please. This is a direct quote from statute and also from the Stanson versus Mott case. Communication expressly advocates when it uses words like vote for, elect, support, cast your ballot, etc. The last line there in yellow is the one that I want you to pay particular attention to. If it unambiguously urges a particular result in an election, but doesn't necessarily say vote for, vote against, it still could be considered improper advocacy. If the message is, we want you to vote a certain way, we're just not saying it, that's where we get into a danger zone of what I call hidden advocacy. And you have to be really careful not to cross that line into advocacy, even though you're being careful not to say vote yes or vote no. If the result of what you're looking for is pretty obvious, the legal authorities are still going to look at it as advocacy. Next slide, please. They look at things like style, as I said before. Is it consistent with other communications? Or is it a situation where the city's normal sort of recreation guide or the notice about the water rates going up or trash pickup days looks a certain way, goes out in a certain format, but when we start talking about an election, it's very splashy and it's got photos of kids and police officers and uses more graphics and tries to make sure that we get more eyes on that election related communication as opposed to just the normal city business communications. I'm sorry, I keep referring to cities, but I know y'all represent all different kinds of public agencies. The concepts are the same. Tenor is another thing that the FPPC and others look toward. Is it moderate? Is it unemotional? Does it use terms like if passed and not when passed? Is it positive as opposed to negative? Negative can be kind of a scare tactic. And we've seen this now in the last couple of enforcement decisions from the FPPC, where they say if the language is being put out as kind of a scare tactic, if this doesn't pass, we're going to close fire stations. If this measure doesn't give us more revenue, we're not going to be able to maintain our police patrols. Those kinds of emotional, negative consequence type of communications are much more likely to be viewed as being advocacy than a more factual, more positive communication that says this measure will provide funds to upgrade existing services or maintain existing services. Those kind of unemotional tone is much more likely to be viewed as being impartial. Explaining the process is certainly okay. I have clients that have land use measures, a couple of them that are related to housing element issues. In those cases, it's not really intuitive to the voters as to what the issue is. And those, it's not just should our taxes go up or should our taxes stay the same? It's really, here's what this would mean if this measure is adopted. And that type of process, type of communication where you're explaining the process is much more likely to be impartial public information as opposed to considered to be advocacy. It's certainly okay for public agencies to urge people to get out and vote. It's certainly okay for public agencies to spend money on voter registration efforts. That is the subject of a reported case. As long as you're not getting them out to register to vote or out to the vote by saying, we need you to go vote for Measure A, those are kind of expenditures are acceptable. The other one is timing. Communications before a measure is put on the ballot versus communications after the measure is on the ballot, as we talked about in the slide before. Those are going to be viewed suspiciously by the FPPC and others. There's a lot of education that can go on before a measure is actually on the ballot, telling people why the city council or the board of directors is considering putting a measure on the ballot, as opposed to communication after the election is already identified, the measure is identified. Those communications are going to look a lot more like the public agency is trying to convince the voters about a measure that's already on the ballot. Pay attention to normal communication cycles. That's also part of timing. If the agency's normal pattern is to have a quarterly newsletter, going outside of that pattern to time up with, for example, the day that we know that vote by mail ballots are delivered to voters, looks suspicious. Sticking with the normal cadence of communications and just including a fact sheet about a ballot measure in the normal city newsletter or whatever typically goes out is a much better way to handle it. In the case of the County of LA, a couple of years ago, paid a very large fine for advocacy communications that were judged to be advocacy. One of the things that the FPPC pointed to was the fact that the Board of Supervisors put a measure on the ballot and at the same meeting adopted a special budget appropriation to pay for additional communications. And the FPPC pointed to that, and the challenger pointed to that and said, look, they decided there was going to be a ballot measure. They then appropriated money to communicate about that ballot measure. That's not part of their normal communications pattern. And it was an indication that what they were intending to do was advocate for their tax measure. Next slide, please. Some recent enforcement examples, things that are giving us more of an idea of how the FPPC views these issues. It's a really common practice for a city manager or a general manager to send a letter that we, typically call a dear neighbor letter that says, want you to just take a look at this measure that is going to appear on your November ballot, and here's the reason we put it on the election, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. If that dear neighbor letter is inconsistent with normal communications from the public agency, the FPPC regulation says that might be indicative of it being advocacy and urging a particular result in an election and not just information, even if the communication itself never actually says vote yes or vote no. So those communications are really, really important to craft carefully to make sure that the intent is we're just letting people know there's a ballot measure, we're letting people know what it means, and we're letting people know what perhaps the uses of the funds are in a very impartial way. When you start to do those kinds of communications in a pattern that doesn't line up normally with the city's communications, the FPPC is warning that they may view that as being election-related advocacy. For example, in a recent 2023 case, a city sent one of those letters, kind of a flashy mailer type thing, in the utility bills. And they had never provided any other information in the utility bills. And so that communication stood out And for that and other reasons, the FPPC decided that those expenditures were intended to urge a result in an election, and they brought an enforcement action against that city. I see a lot of communications professionals advocating that cities should take out digital advertising, Facebook, TikTok, any kind of digital platform that cities should um, purchase digital advertising in those platforms to get the word out. There's a regulation that says digital advertising is per se going to be considered advocacy communications. That's not to say normal social media posts with impartial information would fall into that definition, but a digital advertisement where you pay for the digital space to do your advertising, probably completely inconsistent with what your public agency normally does. And that's going to be viewed to be improper political advocacy. Again, like I gave the example of the special appropriation in LA County, special appropriations for activities that relate to an election, not the holding of the election itself, but communications relating to a ballot measure are going to look like advocacy related expenditures. And finally, style that is intended to invoke emotion, like I talked about a minute ago. Pictures of firemen with soot on their faces saving a kid. That negative kind of scare tactic communication is always going to draw notice as those kinds of things that are intended to invoke emotion, and by invoking emotion, really directing voters and unambiguously urging a result, just by virtue of the fact that you're either scaring voters or making them feel a certain way in relation to a ballot measure is going to be a problem. Next slide, please. Things that cannot be done. You should take this slide with you. We can say for sure production, printing of campaign literature, vote yes, vote no, support this candidate, support not. As I said before, digital advertising is just a clear no. Campaign use of public equipment, whether it's fire trucks and police cars being used for a campaign photo, or Xerox machines, do we even call them that anymore? Copying machines being used to print up flyers. Supplies, technology cannot be used for political purposes. Cannot distribute campaign material at public facilities, like on the bookshelf outside the city council chambers or in the library, or those kinds of things. Campaign material cannot be distributed in that way. Public agencies cannot exhibit favoritism or discrimination against a particular message. That's why we always advise not to link, for example, a city website to a campaign website, because once you bring you say, well, we're just providing information, we're just linking to this website. Once you link to one side, you got to link to the other side. And so avoiding favoritism and discrimination against particular messages is really important. And in my mind, it argues against just avoiding any kind of campaign related message or connection to a campaign related message. Mass mailings at public expense, you probably already know, are illegal. That the normal context is when we have a mass mailing of 200 or more pieces distributed to the voters in a calendar month. It cannot feature an elected official. That's a pretty common rule that everybody understands. You can't have the mayor's picture in a mass mailing that goes out to the voters, or the council members' signatures, or those kinds of things. The other way it applies in the election context is, and they have been prosecuting this now, is a mass mailing that has a political message, even if it doesn't feature an elected official, still violates this mass mailing rule. So a mass mailing that is sent out with that Dear Neighbor type of format, that has emotional tones, that it is clear by the style or tenor or tone of the communication that it's unambiguously urging a result, even if it doesn't have an elected official's photo, even if it doesn't expressly say vote yes or vote no, could violate the mass mailing rule. And that's how the FPPC is really getting you, is by penalizing them for violation of the mass mailing rule, and then saying because that mass mailing rule was violated, that means that expenditure was for political purposes and it should have been reported as a political campaign expense. And those are the basic violations that the FPPC is now prosecuting in the case of public agency expenditures. Next slide, please. There are things that public agencies can do with public resources. Drafting a measure, pre-measure polling. A lot of agencies hire a pollster at the beginning to try to decide whether or not to put something on the ballot or how to word it. That's okay. There's an FPPC advice letter that says that's okay. Providing impartial information about a measure, about an election, voter registration, and get out the vote efforts, as I talked about a minute ago. A public agency body can take a resolution of support or opposition to a ballot measure as long as they do so on an agenda at a public meeting. So your city council can endorse your sales tax measure or oppose a county growth measure or whatever it might be. They could take a position publicly in support or opposition to a ballot measure as long as they do it on an agenda at a public meeting. Then that becomes the position of the city, the position of the county, the position of the district that can be reported out to people who ask. And so if people say, hey, how does the city council feel about this? Well, here's the resolution that they adopted. So that's an effective way to get your public agencies, your governing body's opinion on the issue out for the public to know about. Again, as long as it's on an agenda, it's voted on, and it's done publicly. What you can't do is then publicize that position, like by mailing it out to the voters or taking out an ad that says, here's what the city council did. It's just a policy position. It can be presented in at requests for information. And it can be a public expression of support or opposition by the entire governing body. Next slide, please. Public employees, there are some real prohibitions, and what I typically do at the beginning of a ballot measure campaign, especially when a city puts something on, is I provide kind of a do's and don'ts memo, and I have a standard thing that I have been sending out for years that says you can do this and you can't do that, and this is taken from that memo. Public employees may not work on campaign activities during compensated time. Flat out can't do it. They may not be coerced or directed into working on a campaign in off hours. It has to be their choice if they're going to do it on their off hours. May not use city or district resources or technology for campaign activities. And this is important. City employees, district employees, county employees cannot campaign in uniform. There's a specific section of the government code that prohibits public employees from campaigning in uniform. So there was a question in the list of questions, which I think most of which I'm answering during the presentation, but there was a question about employees wearing buttons or things like that. Now, most public agencies have a personnel rule that covers that, but you should be aware that if you have uniformed employees, they are not allowed to engage in campaign activities while in uniform. Next slide, please. Public employees, public officials may not circulate petitions on official time, and they may not solicit directly or indirectly a political contribution from another employee or officer. So people can't be walking around, whether it's your city council members or your governing body members or a manager saying, hey, we really need to support this ballot measure campaign. Why don't you write a check? That can't happen in City Hall or your headquarters building, and it can't be a solicitation from one employee to another or an officer to an employee. And public agencies and their managers may not promise employment action in exchange for a vote, essentially a bribe. That is illegal, except for, and I'm not calling this a bribe, union members can engage in union activities, right? And talk about who should vote, how people should vote on a union election. That's not covered within this rule, but promising employment action in exchange for a vote can be a misdemeanor. Next slide, please. When in doubt, if you're looking at it and you're saying, I'm not really sure about this, it's probably advocacy, because you're probably not thinking about communicating just for the purpose of providing impartial information. If that thought causes you to go, well, I wonder which side of the line this falls on, it's probably advocacy and probably impermissible if you really have to think about it. And as I said before, the stakes are too high to push the envelope. There are potential criminal penalties. There are potential financial penalties. People can be disqualified from holding public office in the future. And if campaign activity violates personnel rules, employees can be subject to discipline or termination. So it's really important to consult with the agency attorney in advance and make this a team kind of effort. Decide what can be said and how it can be said to inform the public about an election, but not do it in a way that is urging a result one way or another in support of or opposition to a candidate or a ballot measure. Next slide, please. There are ways to get the message out, and I think that's, a key takeaway. You don't really need to push the envelope on the public agency side, because there are ways to get the message out. It may take more effort, it may take more time, and it may be a little more out of control of the public agency. Excuse me, but there are ways to communicate the messages that people who are interested in the public agency want to convey to the voters. The biggest one of which is it can be done through a campaign group. If a ballot measure is good for a community, then there ought to be people in the community who are willing to step up and form a campaign group to do the advocacy that's needed to get a ballot measure passed or needed to get a ballot measure defeated. And that's the point of our system of government, is people in the community step up and get involved in democracy rather than letting the government agency put its thumb on the scales. Now, that may require that staff members have to go to a lot of Kiwanis meetings, a lot of community meetings after hours to make something happen. But we have non-exempt employees exempt employees that might, be willing to do that if the issue is important enough to their employer. They're not doing it officially, but they're out in the community trying to organize a little support on their own time. There's plenty of room to inform the public about ballot issues and their purposes and consequences in an impartial way, if the motivation is really to inform the public and let them make their own decisions. It is certainly permissible to make one or more staff members available to respond to requests for information. And that's a key distinction. The Stanson versus Mott case very clearly said, when people ask for information, then the public agency can provide it. If people want a presentation at the Kiwanis Club meeting or the Rotary Club meeting, it's okay to go out and provide that impartial information in that setting if it's been requested. It's another good reason to have a resolution of the governing body in support of a measure, because then it's just reporting a piece of factual information. Our city council has taken a position endorsing Measure L or measure whatever it is. That's reporting a piece of factual information, and upon request, a city employee can do that. But most of all, if people really want to be involved in trying to influence the voters, they should do it on their own time. And I think, as everybody who is a taxpayer would say, that taxpayer resources should be used for the benefit of an entire community and not necessarily in furtherance of somebody's political objectives. So those are, what I can think of as the best ways to get the message out. And I think if you've got a measure on a ballot that's going forward in November, there's certainly time to get a campaign group organized. If you're considering a measure in the future, one of the key things that should be considered as part of that effort is people getting together on their own time with their own resources to support or oppose a measure. Next slide, please. I saw there were a list of questions. I think I've covered a number of them, and we'll probably have plenty of time coming up to respond to some of them that Melissa has sort of sussed out to talk about. But some of the common things that come out, common questions that I get at this time of year, I'll talk about on this slide. One is, can a public agency sponsor a candidates forum in a public facility? The answer is yes. There's a specific regulation that talks about expenses for hosting a candidates forum, like in your city council chambers or in a community room or something like that. That's a permissible use of public resources, even though candidates are going to come in and say, vote for me, as long as everybody is invited. You can't have a selective candidates forum and not invite people who don't seem like credible candidates or whatever. As long as everybody's invited, there's a FPPC regulation that says a candidates forum is an appropriate way to use public resources in the election process. I also get questions about whether staff can draft ballot arguments. And intuitively, you would kind of say, well, no, that's somebody's going to say vote yes or vote no. There actually is an FPPC regulation that says that if the legislative body is permitted by law to submit an argument, and if the legislative body puts a measure on the ballot, they are permitted to submit an argument. A staff time to draft that argument is not considered a political expenditure. So that's a real narrow restriction, and it's something to talk to your agency attorney about. But just that process of drafting the measure by a city staff person or a public agency staff person, drafting the argument, probably okay, but I would really talk to your agency attorney about it. We get a lot of questions about whether city or district or county photographs and video can be used by candidates. There's not a really clear answer to that, other than to say, if those photographs of something that happened at a city event, for example, or a presentation that was made, or a ribbon cutting or something like that, if those photographs or videos are out in public, like the city publicizes the event and anybody can go on the internet and just download a photo, my belief is that the use of the photo for a campaign purpose cannot really be deemed to be a campaign expenditure by the public agency. However, if they're not normally available and there's an event and the city has a photographer show up and take some pictures and then gives it to the candidate for political purposes, I think that's a real problem. So it's just that kind of quote unquote public domain concept. If anybody can get access to the photographs and use them, I think that's generally okay. If they're specially taken and specially given by the public agency to a public official, I think that's a problem. Booths at public events, if the information and the interaction is completely impartial, it's just permitted information that is being distributed at the booth, I think it's okay to have a booth that says there will be a measure on the ballot. Please get out and vote. Here's a fact sheet, but no advocacy taking place. That interaction is probably just the same thing as mailing or emailing that fact sheet or putting it on a city's social media site. Information on public websites. I'm a big proponent, actually, of having a factual section on a public agency website that just says facts about measure X. Um, that might be a staff report that was presented to the governing body with staff's opinion as to why the measure should be put on the ballot. It may be the city attorney's impartial analysis. It may actually be the page from the sample ballot that has the question. I don't see how any of that could be deemed to be advocacy when it's already been presented publicly. It's just collected in one place. That makes it easier for people who are trying to find information. I would not, frankly, recommend linking to campaign websites, linking to candidate websites, linking to any information that is not just official, impartial information. Town hall meetings, kind of the same thing as a candidates forum, but you got to give room for all viewpoints to be exhibited. Campaigning on public property, it depends, and you'll have to talk to your agency about this, but there was a question about campaign signs in parks and in medians and along the sidewalk leading into City Hall, something like that. If the facility is normally designated as a public forum, like a lot of parks are, then a campaign event there might be okay. But typically, public agencies prohibit signs from being erected in a park or in a right of way or along a street on public property. So you can't selectively allow signs in favor of a ballot measure, for example, when other things are being prohibited. The best practice is to prohibit everything where that type of campaign activity is not allowed. Those are kind of the most common questions. Melissa, do you have a couple others you'd like me to address?
Yes, so I'm taking a look at the questions that came in ahead of time, as well as the ones that have been coming in live during the webinar today, and we've got quite a few. But I'm noticing some themes, and so I'm hoping you can address a couple of these, and then I also just want to note for folks that if we don't get to your question, we can follow up offline. We've got some written resources we can share with you all as well. And I want to address the fact that a couple of you have asked for references or citations. We'll follow up offline with that information for you all as well. But in terms of a couple of things that I'm seeing come up a number of times, first, can you speak to the use of campaign funds for ballot measure activity? So for example, if a candidate or an incumbent has raised money for a campaign, is that what are the any bright lines or regulations around use of campaign funds for ballot measure activities?
Well, I mean, the first thing I say is that the answer depends on whether your jurisdiction has a local campaign finance ordinance. So if you've got a local campaign finance rule, I'm not answering the question for your jurisdiction because it depends on what your local rules say. Generally, candidates can use their political funds in their political campaign accounts for political purposes. And that might mean contributions to another candidate. It might mean, putting out something related to a ballot measure. But it just depends on whether you've got a local restriction in place. And that would be the answer to the question. But generally, political purposes, the candidate decides what the political purposes are. And so I think that's the basic answer to the question.
So step one would be to check with your agency counsel,
Right.
and then go from there. Perfect. A couple of questions have come in around the digital marketing and ads that you've talked about, and there's some questions around if that's a common practice for the agency. For example, if they do usually spend money to boost posts or do that in their normal communications. Any Is it always a prohibition, or does it go back to the conversation you were having around the tone and tenor and general communication practices?
Digital advertising specifically, for whatever reason, is called out in an FPPC regulation as being something that is not a normal agency communication. So I don't know much about the technology of boosting versus, I don't know, kind of that distinction, but generally, the FPPC reg on what factors they consider in terms of finding that something unambiguously urges a particular result in an election includes a subsection that says digital advertising. So I try to distinguish between social media posts, the normal thing, the city council is meeting on Tuesday night at 7:30 to talk about these things, versus what LA County did, for example, which was pay for advertisements that said Measure H question mark money for homeless services. And those were not normal agency communications because they were paid digital ads. So that's the best answer I can give on that.
Okay. But also something that could be, they could ask for an advice letter from the
Yep.
FPPC or something of that nature if they really wanted to dig into that.
And the FPPC really wants public agencies, and I thank you for bringing that up, because they really want public agencies to ask for advice. There are numerous letters now that are on the FPPC website giving advice on these issues, and they'd like for you to ask in advance. And I have seen them say, yes, this would be considered to be advocacy, but this other thing looks more like what you normally do, and as long as it's impartial, that would be okay. So if you really want to reduce the risk, you can ask for advice in advance, and they will give it.
And we'll make sure to send that link out in the follow-up email as well, so you all have that as a quick reference. There's also been a couple of questions that have come in around going back to the conversation around the fact that the governing body can take a position in a public meeting on a ballot measure or things of that nature. Are there any concerns or lines you'd want to caution folks around the staff time used to prepare that agenda item? Or is that just a general operations or of the agency to provide that information and the facts on it? So anything you wanna caution folks about around staff time for
Yeah,
the
and I can only answer this based on experience, not I unfortunately can't point to a regulation the way I can point to with the ballot argument that I had mentioned a couple of minutes ago. But my feeling is that if the law permits a public agency to consider their position at a public meeting and actually requires it to be, considered on the agenda at a public meeting, I think as long as the agency sort of expends the normal staff effort that would be expended on any agenda item, it has to be okay. I think the problem might be if the agency decided to bring in a communications consultant to, help craft the message that was going to be presented at the city council meeting, or they had a focus group to decide which argument would be more effective if the city council adopted it, or something like that. I think that's outside of normal preparation for a normal agenda item might be questionable. But I think everybody knows that for part-time volunteer members of a governing body, they don't spend time preparing agenda items. That's what professional staff is for. So I participated in dozens of times preparing those kinds of staff reports, and I think that's okay.
We'll do one final question here because we're getting close on time, and then again we can follow up and we'll share some additional resources in that email. But you had mentioned candidate forums and if you're inviting all of the candidates and things like that, that could be a permissible use. But what about ballot measures? So if you were to have a forum on a ballot measure that has the pros and cons, or invites proponents on both sides, is that something that would be potentially permissible?
Yeah, unfortunately, that regulation doesn't specifically speak to the candidate, I'm sorry, the ballot measure forum in the same way that it does the candidate forum. That's why I kind of referred to the town hall meeting. I think it's that kind of information, using a city facility for that kind of information is okay. As long as, both both sides are invited to attend. I think the potential practical problem there is you don't always know who's on the other side, or you don't always, it may not always be in the public interest to amplify the voice of somebody who might be on the other side. So I think that has to be a real careful consideration. In my view, it would be better if a community organization was sponsoring that forum so that the local board of realtors or the League of Women Voters or whoever, the Chamber of Commerce, is responsible for the content and the filtering of the content and not the city.
Okay,
So that's kind of a distinction I would draw.
that makes sense. Okay, well, unfortunately, we are at time, and I know there's a lot more questions. This is definitely a hot topic in light of the timing we're at and the election coming up very quickly.
Yeah,
Of
can I make one more quick point, Melissa?
course,
Just on the way out, there was a question about uh, giving advice. How, sort of, is there a style or a way to give advice to incumbents and to candidates who are asking for stuff? And I work with a lot of city clerks. I work with a lot of staff on those issues where candidates really put a lot of pressure on, or they want something that might be used for political advantage. And I just think that it's really important to, from the top down, to kind of promote a culture of impartiality. And if my slides, for example, can be something you want to wave around to say, look, I went to a seminar and here's a lawyer telling me I can't do this, feel free. I just think that it's that culture of impartiality, and I know that in the moment it's often handy to have a piece of paper that says, here's something you can look at. So I would encourage you to do that if it's at all helpful.
perfect. And I just moved the slides ahead a couple, so you have our contact information if you would like to follow up with either Craig or myself. And as I mentioned, and you saw maybe that last slide, we will be distributing the slide deck as well as the recording. And I've mentioned a couple of times some additional resources. So we'll make sure to get you all the link to that FPPC advice letter section in case you want to pursue that. We at ILG have a couple of do's and don'ts types documents on this topic as well that we'll make sure to send links to. And then as I mentioned, the references that you asked for, we will also make sure to get those out to you all. But I know it was a short amount of time with a lot of content and a lot of questions, and so I'm sure there was things we didn't get to. But we really appreciate your time and joining us for your lunch hour and participating in this conversation. And then Craig, I just want to thank you for sharing your depth of experience and expertise on this topic and answering as many of these questions as we could this afternoon. And so thank you for doing that. And any final words for the audience before we let everybody go?
No, appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate the ILG for organizing this seminar. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.